thank you guys for joining us today. Today we're going to talk a little bit about what we've got new coming out in our latest release. So one of the first things I'm going to go ahead and kind of address is the release versioning. You're going to notice a little bit of a difference where we were previously, 15.1, 15.2, up to 16, 16.4.1 is the current GA release up until our next one comes out. So first thing I'm going to talk about is the versioning. So we have changed our versioning model. So rather than using incrementing off of 16 and going up to 17, we are going to start using a year, month type numbering scheme. So you may be something you may notice where if you're on version 16.4.1 and all of a sudden we're at version 25, you're like, hey, wait a minute, I missed a whole lot of versions there, approximately 11. No, you did not. We are changing our versioning scheme, so you are going to see some differences there. It's just going to help better align with the way that we see a lot of vendors and a lot of our integrations are changing their schemes and builds as well. Right. So the next thing I'm going to go ahead and talk about are some of the changes here. And this is going to be a little bit more of a show and tell than it is going to be a live demonstration. A lot of the changes that we have are done in the background, so there's not a lot to show, but we're going to talk about what we are changing. So the first thing I'm going to start with is some Zoom cradle to grave reporting. If you've been hanging out with us over the last few weeks, you'll have heard that we released Zoom cradle to grave reporting in 16.40, made a few improvements here and there, and again with 25.2.1 we also have some additional improvements on our cradle to grave reporting. So the first thing I'm going to do is bring up a report here to kind of show you an example of what some of those improvements are. And a lot of these are going to be based around, one, the cradle to grave reporting, but two, also some summary statistics as they relate to call queues specifically. So much like with our other products, we try not to take the data at face value all the time because sometimes it could be a bit misleading as to what's going on in an environment. So if you just took row to row what somebody is telling you, you're really not making a better reporting system. You're just regurgitating what is there from a CDR perspective. So first thing I'm going to touch on is Zoom cradle to grave. So this is a huge advantage for us. Again, if you've been hanging out with us for the last couple of weeks, you'll notice that we've been talking a lot about cradle to grave. We've had a lot of customers that have been able to use this. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is how we are doing some of the cradle to grave reporting. And one of the changes in 25.2.1 is how we relate the call queues back to the cradle to grave calls. So prior to 25.2.1, when a call came into a call queue, we would have a called party that was related to the call queue. So we could track how many calls went to the call queue. Sounds great in theory. The problem is with Zoom cradle to grave, what happens when a call goes to the queue is it goes to the queue, but then it rolls to multiple people. Well, you also want to be able to see not only how many calls are coming into your queue, but what agents are actually taking those calls. Right. So with 25.2.1, one of the changes that we made is we started adding the call queues to each individual call row. So what does that mean? So let me pop down to a call that's got several hops to it, so we can look at a good example here. So in this sequence 484 right here, what we can see is this call comes into the queue and rolls over to our user here, Bree. So that's one call. Bree did not answer this call. So subsequently, the call then bounces over to other queue. In this case, it goes over to an employee engagement queue. And it rings on two different users before it goes to an auto attendant, which subsequently rolls the call back into the public relations. And we get this round robin type of effect until the call ends or is answered. Prior to 25.2.1, what we would see is the call come into the public relations, but we really didn't have any information as to who in public relations didn't answer that call. So with 25.2.1, we've made a big change. So what we started to do is we actually incremented and added the queues to all of the callers that actually received a call. So whether they answered the call or not, you're going to now be able to see, hey, this is how many calls went to Bree, this is how many calls went to Matt, and so on and so forth. So by adding those additional queues, it actually did two different things. One, it gives you more granular reporting at your user level. So as I scroll up into this report, we now see that 63 calls were presented to Bree over here. 14 of those calls were answered. 49 of those were not connected. In other words, they rang out and Bree did not have the opportunity to answer, and they subsequently maybe went to somebody else, possibly over to Kim here in the other queue. On that same line, we could see that 53 calls went into Kim, and 36 of those were answered. So the benefit here by adding those additional queues and stamping those records with the queues is you're going to get much better granularity, not only on what your queues are doing, but also how your agents are answering those calls. Now you may say, hey, you know what? I saw a little bit of that functionality back in 16.4.1 if you're a Zoom user. Yes, we did have some of that functionality in there, but it wasn't quite as thorough. Because on top of what we did by doing that is we've also increased the total volume of calls going to the queue. So what does that mean? That means prior to 25.2.1, the total amount of calls coming into your queue would have actually shown 245 calls. All right. Now, being from an analytics perspective and an analytics vendor, when we're looking at things in two different summary levels, we're looking at one, we want to know how busy our queue is. We want to know the total number of calls coming into the queue, not how many hops the call took in the queue. In other words, if it rang on me and Brian, I don't want to see that as two separate calls. I want to see that as one call into my queue so I can better staff my queue. So what we've done here is not only have we added the individual statistics at the users, but we've also updated the total summary statistics so they're a better representation of the actual number of calls hitting the call queue. So this was a big improvement because anybody looking at the reports previously may have said, well, this number seems inflated. I don't think 245 people called my queue. And they were right. 245 people didn't call the queue. What happened is the call hit the queue and it rolled 245 different times throughout the various calls until it was answered. So what we've done is we've actually consolidated the metrics. At the user level, you're still going to show the total volume of calls. And again, we want that because we need to see the volume of calls at the user because that way it lets me know, hey, is Brian answering his phone or is he not answering his phone? But when I'm looking at the queue level, I just want to see the total number of calls, not how many hops the call took. So what we've done in 25.2.1 is we just made those numbers a little bit more accurate to what people want to see. User level is going to show how many calls were presented to the user level. And summary search set or queue level is going to show the total number of calls presented to the queue individually. All right. And a perfect example of this is let me go ahead and scroll through here and I'm going to get down to some cradle to grave. And we're going to look at a particular sequence where we can see a call came into the queue twice. Prior to 25.2.1, this would have reported as 4 different calls into the public relations call queue. With the improvements we've made in 25.2.1, this is going to now show as 2 different calls into the public relations call queue. Why? Because this call hit the call queue. They did not answer. The call subsequently went to the employee engagement, and then rolled back to the public relations queue. So rather than looking at this as 4 separate calls, this is now going to be 2 separate calls. And as I kind of scroll up in here, some of these other ones are very pertinent as well. Prior to 25.2.1, if I was looking at the total summary of my call queue, I was looking at this as 2 different calls. Now, we have sequencing options, and we always had, and a lot of our Zoom customers were previously relying on the sequence total counts. The problem with that is that would then skew your things like abandon rates and answer rates and things like that. So we've really taken essentially a lot of that sequencing logic and we built it into the total summary logic. That helps improve not only your call volume counts, but also things like your abandoned percentages, abandoned percentages, or voicemail percentages. So this is a big change for our Zoom customers. A lot of people have kind of been asking for those numbers to look a little bit better than what it was being presented. So we listened, we heard you guys, and we went ahead and made those changes, and those are now in the 25.2.1. Another thing that we also offered changed within our application is the way sharing of dashboards works. So previously in 16.4.1, if you shared a Zoom dashboard, let's say, for example, Brian has a dashboard and he is limited to only being able to see the system engineering department. If he shared that dashboard to me, and I was not supposed to see the system engineering department, or I didn't have the privileges to see that department, I would still inherit those privileges because Brian actually shared them over to me. So just for that dashboard, I would be able to see exactly what Brian was seeing. Now, that made sense for a lot of people because what they were trying to do is say, hey, I want to see Brian's dashboard. However, from a security perspective, we felt that that was not quite fair. If Brian shared that dashboard to me, but an administrator came in and said, Victor is not able to see the system engineering group, in that case, I would be able to get privileges that perhaps I wasn't supposed to have. So what we've done is we went ahead and shored that up. Now, if Brian shares that dashboard to me and I don't have access to that department or that site that he's trying to share, my dashboard is going to come back with 0 results. Again, the purpose of this here is really just for security. You can share things out, but you're not going to be allowed to share data to somebody that they're not allowed to see. Right. So a couple of Zoom changes in there. Again, the biggest one being the ability to summarize those queues, just understand better from a total volume perspective how many unique calls are coming into the queue, but also from the individual agent perspective, how many calls are being presented to those agents. So out of the 129 total unique calls that came in, this is how many times they were presented to the various agents, and that would have been equal to 245 times throughout the various queues as those calls rolled to people that either answered or did not answer them. So great metrics. Again, if you're looking to learn a little bit more about Zoom and the cradle to grave reporting, we've got a couple of great webinars out there that we've done over the past few weeks. So feel free to dig into those. Those don't really change anything that we're talking about here. A lot of that information is still pertinent and really talks about how those cradle to grave sequences are being broken down and just understanding the call flows as you're looking through these. The next thing I'm going to talk a little bit about, much less show and tell here than just being able to talk about it, is anybody that's familiar with our remote phone control. So our remote phone control application gives people the ability to do what it says it does, and that's essentially control phones. Prior to 25.2.1, this was very much IPv4 only. So IPv4 being the protocol that you're using to communicate throughout your network. You have which is the common 10.10.10 or whatever IP address. We see a lot of federal governments. There's been a mandate out for quite some time that federal governments have to switch off of IPv4 and go to strictly IPv6. So what we've done with Variphy 25.2.1, we are now compatible with phone control in IPv6. So if you are an organization out there that's going to be starting to rely on or already relies on IPv6, whether you're using dual mode or singular mode, Variphy is now compatible. The way that that's going to function is we're going to go ahead and look for IPv4. If it's not populated on your phone system, or if essentially none in your call manager, we're automatically going to use IPv6. If you have both IPv4 and IPv6 and you're using dual within your environment, we will go ahead and try IPv4. If that one does not work, we will go ahead and switch over to IPv6. So again, nice thing about that is it's totally seamless for you guys. There's nothing you guys really need to do. It's automatic. We're going to recognize what you guys have programmed in your environment. The next thing I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about is dashboarding. Again, this is a little bit more behind the scenes type of thing, but we've made some improvements to our dashboarding and specifically how our widgets refresh, as well as a lot around how our permalinks are refreshing. So those that are familiar with using the permalink is basically a static link that you could send to anybody that is a dashboard. This is much different than, let's say, sharing a dashboard that we already talked about. When I'm sharing a dashboard, I'm sending that dashboard to a user that already exists in Variphy. They already have login credentials. But when I'm looking at something from a permalink perspective, essentially what I'm doing is I'm sending somebody a hyperlink to a dashboard. They do not have to have a login to the Variphy system. All they really need is a copy of this link, and it is static, so they could save it as a favorite. And essentially what they can do is bring it up on any browser without having to worry about login access to Variphy. So the way that worked previously is each of those permalinks, and if my dashboard would eventually load here, this is what we get for doing things on labs sometimes. But essentially what would happen is each one of those permalinks, and we've got customers out there that run hundreds and hundreds of permalinks. Each one of those permalinks acted relatively individually. So what does that mean? That basically means that it would look from a dashboard and widget perspective and say, oh, okay, each one of these dashboards or each one of these permalinks is unique. So I'm going to refresh these unique. And that created a lot of workload on the Variphy system, as well as a lot of workload on the database. And depending on what platform you are using, it may create some additional workload on the platform as well. Um, so what we've done is we've now consolidated that. We really streamlined the way that the widgets refresh in the permalink. So these particular widgets here all have a stream. They all have data. They all have cached data within the Variphy system. So rather than having to try to reinvent the wheel every time somebody opens up a permalink, we rely back on a lot of that cache data to refresh those widgets. So rather than saying, hey, of course, my permalink isn't going to work here. I probably didn't turn it on in time. But rather than saying, hey, for each 100 of those permalinks that everybody is looking at, this widget's going to refresh. This widget's going to refresh. And it's going to go out and gather the same data from the database that this other permalink is grabbing from. So we've really made some background changes to streamline that. So rather than saying, hey, we've got to get new data for this widget and this widget and this widget, and do that 100 times for each individual permalink, we're now looking at more of a caching perspective. We're saying, hey, we don't need to repull all of this data. This is going to act as a single entity and pull it all for the same users. It's not going to impact your refresh rates. Your refresh rates for your permalink are still going to be different than the refresh rates from somebody else's permalink. It's just going to all grab the data from the same pool. It's going to make it a lot more efficient for a lot of our customers using those permalinks. Right. Next thing I'm going to go ahead and show is something that we've added here for some requests. From time to time, we'll have some users that have network issues. Look, it happens. So, things like reports may not go out. Perhaps we've lost connectivity to a database. Perhaps we lost connectivity to a SMTP server. So when that would happen, your reports obviously would fail. Because if you have scheduled reports that were designed to go out via email and we couldn't talk to a database server and gather the information for those reports, or if we couldn't talk to the SMTP server to be able to email out the report would fail. Now, within Variphy, obviously, you do have the ability to set up an alert. So if a report does fail, you can go ahead and get an email, or an administrator can get an email saying, hey, this report failed. But what would happen is that would trigger an event for an administrator. They would have to go back and manually rerun that report for somebody. So what we've added in 25.2.1 is this guy right here. So what this is going to do is it's going to give the ability to set, verify, and configure it to automatically retry reports. So let's say, for example, we have a network error. We're doing some network work. Maybe we're doing something on our SMTP server and a report fails. Prior to 25.2.1, in order to get that report again, you had to go manually rerun it. So what we've added is some abilities to retry reports. So I can try a report every hour. So let's say a report fails. Well, in an hour, I'm going to try that report again. The next hour, I'm going to try that report again. This will repeat 3 different times. So up to 3 different times, it'll try until it ultimately says, you know what, I can't run this report. And that's going to require somebody obviously looking into why the report is failing in the first place and then manually rerunning it. And if I set this to every 6 hours, it's going to go ahead and retry that report every 6 hours up to 3 different times. So it'll try, up to 18 hours. All right. Now, one of the questions that came up is, okay, well, what if my report, I don't know, let's say it's scheduled to run every hour, and it fails, and it go ahead and it fail, and we're set here for every 3 hours. Is it going to go back and retry my report for that 1 hour where it failed, that first report? The answer is yes. It's going to respect the time frames based on that schedule. So if I am running a report every hour, but that report doesn't kick off for 12 hours, it's going to go back and say, hey, you missed this 1 hour. I'm going to rerun that report for you. All right. So a great feature add, again, really just kind of making the system a little bit more seamless, a little less manual intervention should something does something fail. It is going to, I'll go ahead and automatically retry that several different times. And of course, anybody that has the alert set up for report failures or anything like that will go ahead and get those error messages that the report is failing. All right. The next one I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about, and again, this is a little bit more behind the scenes, is some of how the MS Teams data was cradle to grave was relating. So prior to 25.2.1, we had some, if we were running report, let's say calls for queues or departments, or maybe my auto attendants. When we were matching our cradle to grave, there's several different fields that we rely on to be relatively unique in a scenario. So that allows us to kind of match all the calls. So in this example here, we're looking at a call that went to a queue, and we could see about 8 rows of call data. And we were running at this, and we were looking at it from a cradle to grave. This looks pretty well complete, but we did find some issues where certain rows or row types were not being included in the cradle to grave. This didn't really have a big impact on things like summary values, but it did have an impact on following a call through. This didn't necessarily impact, like, who talked to this person. Did Jim talk to him? Did Victor talk to him? That information was still there, and that really hasn't changed. But what was being omitted were some of the things like auto attendance, or if a call got transferred out and then back in. So this being the same call that we were just looking at there, what we can see is now we have about 10 rows of data, and we've added a couple things. We've added an auto attendant in here, and some test auto attendant information. Now, these rows were being omitted previously because some of the IDs that necessarily aren't supposed to change sometimes. So what we've done is really just kind of shored up our logic and filled in some gaps, to be able to say, hey, okay, we have some what I'll call automatic routines taking place within this cradle to grave sequence. So now we are getting more of that complete picture, adding some of those auto attendant legs into the cradle to grave. Again, didn't have a huge impact on any of the summary values that we had our team's folks were looking at, but it did have an impact in understanding, how did a call get here in the first place? And in that case, something like an auto attendant leg may have been missing. And then really the last couple things I want to talk about here. One is those that are familiar with our ability to decommission a cluster. Decommissioning a cluster is for a lot of our existing customers. We have a ton of customers migrating over to different platforms, be it WebEx, MS Teams, Zoom. But that doesn't mean that their CDR data we can just forget about, like we don't have anymore. People have compliance reasons. They have to be able to manage and keep that old data. Well, how do you do that when a cluster is no longer online? In other words, my call manager is gone, but I still need that call manager data. So from a Variphy perspective, we do have the ability to do what's called a decommissioned cluster. Essentially, what that will do is it allows the cluster to stay live in Variphy. You're not going to be able to receive data or process any new data because you don't have a call manager anymore. But what it does do is allows you to keep the reporting and all of the analytics for your compliance available for your system. Now, what we did see in some cases is that when a system was decommissioned, the Variphy system would actually still go out and try to talk to that call manager. So we found some issues within our end. Again, it wasn't impacting, so that way, you were getting wrong data, anything from a historical perspective, but it did have some impact on being able to run reports. So we made some adjustments in our system. So if you are decommissioned or you do have a decommissioned system out there, it is worth getting 25.2.1 out in your system to prevent any possible issues further down the road. But this is basically going to allow you to decommission that system, and we are no longer going to even attempt to reach out to your call manager for any purposes. If you guys want a little bit more information on the decommission, again, we do have a WebEx that talks a little bit more about it, but you can absolutely reach out to your customer success manager if you want a little bit more information on the decommission cluster, how that works and how it can benefit you. And then last but not least, and the biggest one for 25.2.1, unfortunately with this one, I don't have much to show because feature parity was the key here. Those that are familiar with our Cube analytics, prior to 25.2.1, Cube was on-premise only. So we had a lot of customers that are switching off of on-premise, eliminating that hardware footprint or that network center footprint. And we see a lot of people really saving a lot of dollars, from having to keep the environment in their own data center or pay Amazon for it, and moving things over to Variphy Cloud. So a ton of people moving to Variphy Cloud, but with Cisco Cube being on-prem, they kind of had a hybrid environment where they may have call manager analytics up in our Variphy Cloud, but then the Cube analytics would be in their on-prem system. It wasn't hugely impacting because normally when we see people using the call analytics piece, the CUCM analytics or WebEx or anything like that, it's kind of a different audience. We see a lot more business analytics come out of the call manager, things like your queues and who's answering calls, who's not answering calls, where we see the Cube analytics being more used from an administrative perspective, understanding capacity at your cubes, your carriers, the cubes dropping calls. So it didn't have a big impact, but it was cumbersome. We had it was not the best experience for someone to have to go to two different systems to just run a report on some of their Cube data versus some of their call manager data. So with 25.2.1, we are happy to announce that Cube is now in the Variphy Cloud as well. So for those folks that are looking to move some of those on-prem cubes over to Variphy Cloud to meet up with their CUCM cloud, Variphy Cloud data as well, we do have Cube in the cloud as well. There are some caveats. We don't have a one button click to migrate all of your reports and things like that. So there is a bit of manual migration there. But as long as we're storing the Cisco raw data, we're going to be able to migrate that Cisco call data over to your on-prem, or from your on-prem over to your cloud environment. So if you guys are looking to move to Variphy Cloud, eliminate that on-prem footprint, eliminate that data center footprint. As much as we love Amazon and all the other cloud-based providers out there, we also know that they can get pricey after time, especially as systems grow. The more data you house, the bigger your system has to get. So moving that over to Variphy Cloud has been a no-brainer for a lot of people. They've been able to save a lot of money, and we can now support that from a Cube perspective as well as a call manager perspective. And of course, all of our WebEx MS Teams and all those other guys are in Variphy Cloud as well. All right. So, Brian, I think that wraps up what we've got for 25.2.1. Do we have any questions to answer while we're here?
Yeah, we did have a couple questions. First one is, are we planning to support phone control for WebEx registered phones at any point?
I will say at any point, yes. If we have the flexibility to be able to get in there, understanding that, WebEx compared to Call Manager is a different beast. So we have to see what APIs are available for us to be able to communicate through your WebEx platform to talk to those phones. If we can do it, yes, absolutely. One of our big things is always going to be feature parity. We've got a lot of customers that are out there that are used to CUCM, used to having all of our tools and loving all of the tools. So feature parity is a big thing on our map. So if we can remote phone control, I can say, yes, it is something we will do. Do I have any kind of target or time frame for you? At this point, I do not, unfortunately.
Okay. And then we did have another group of questions pertaining to WebEx calling. First one was, are there any plans to add reporting on the WebEx calling queue state, specifically an agent's availability time, idle time, other events such as changing of availability states?
Okay, so that I can take in two different directions. The first one I'll say, when we say queue stats, are we talking about contact center, WebEx contact center? So we're talking about WebEx contact center. Yes, we are currently in development for WebEx contact center. And right now we are targeted for our next release in April. That is preliminary, but that was where our target is. Obviously, if that changes, we'll let everybody know. But right now, we are targeting WebEx Contact Center for April, and that would be our next release. That's where we are looking at live queue stats, agent rates, answer rates, abandonment rates, agent availability, things like that. That'll come out of Contact Center. If we're talking about things like WebEx call queues, not contact center. In that case, we already have a lot of that information. We can see from a WebEx perspective how many calls are coming into your queue, what the answer rates are, the abandonment rates are, but we will not be able to see at this point live stats from an agent. In other words, when we're talking about standard queuing in WebEx, we don't get to see how many people are currently in the queue right now. Or, if those agents don't necessarily have a state. That's more when we get into contact center. So for right now, it is two different things. WebEx Contact Center, yes, we are developing for, so I hope that answers your question. We will be able to have those kinds of times. But if we're talking about just general queue stats, a lot of it we can get. But things like, hey, what is the agent doing right now? What is the state that they were in? Those types of things we just don't see from a standard WebEx. And I always punt back to kind of call queues from Call Manager. We get a lot of those same statistics from that we would see in Call Manager that we do with WebEx when we're talking about just the standard queuing.
Okay. And then
a follow-up question.
Yeah, I think so. And also a follow-up question about WebEx calling as well. Any future plans to build a feature similar to the real-time Hunt Pilot status dashboard for either queues or hunt groups?
I will say, if we're able to gather that type of information, this almost goes back to, I don't know if this is the same person or not, this almost goes back to the phone control question. If we are able to query those phones in that manner, yes, I can guarantee we'll absolutely build something like that. But the big question is if. Right now, I don't know that we're aware of a way of being able to use the APIs in a real-time fashion to actually go out to a phone to see what somebody's state is. So when we were talking about, the real-time hunt group one, a lot of that was going out and looking at Call Manager because it housed that information. WebEx is a different beast. It just does not house a lot of the same information. But I will say, if we can grab it, you guys will be the first to know because you guarantee we'll be doing a webinar on it.
Right.
But yeah, if we can get it, we definitely will.